last little step here. Very good. So now, all right. Welcome to the 100th anniversary series in celebration of Elizabeth Farrell and CEC, hosted by Illinois Council for Exceptional Children. We welcome all of you warmly. Dr. Dave Edyburn is our guest this evening. Dr. Edyburn grew up in Villa Park, that located between Elmhurst and Lombard, Illinois. He attended Illinois State University as an undergraduate student, intending to major in secondary speech education, I guess, a teacher of secondary speech. So during his first semester, someone advised him about these options in special education and that he could graduate with 3 teaching licenses. He changed majors and thus his journey began in special education. After graduating from Illinois State University, Dr. Edyburn taught students with learning disabilities for 5 years in Rock Falls, Illinois. During that time, he earned his master's degree in reading from Illinois State University, where he met his wife. Following 5 years of teaching, his student loans were completely forgiven, and he returned to graduate school at the University of Illinois to study technology in special education. He remembers Commodore, I'm sure some of us do too, and Plato. Today, Dr. Edyburn is a senior research scientist and professor emeritus of University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Most recently, he served as Associate Dean for Research in the College of Community Innovation and Education at the University of Central Florida. His research and teaching interests focus on the use of technology to enhance teaching, learning, and performance, the nexus of human and machine learning, as special education technology, research, and universal design for learning. During 2021, he served as the president of the Pioneers Division of the Council for Exceptional Children. Dr. Edyburn served as editor of numerous professional journals, including Journal of Research in Education, Learning Disability Quarterly, Remedial and Special Education Technology, Practice, Teaching Exceptional Children. He is the guest editor of an upcoming issue of Assistive Technology Outcomes and Benefits. We extend a special welcome to Dr. Dave L. Edyburn. Thank you so much for taking time to join us this evening. And over to you, Dr. Edyburn.
Well, thank you, Paula. A very nice introduction, and welcome to everyone. I appreciate you taking time to be with us tonight, and that you have options besides watching the Olympics. That's exciting. So I'm going to minimize my screen here. There we go. We're going to talk about technology and hopefully take you down a little journey of memory lane this evening. I encourage you to post questions to the chat, and I'll stop a couple times during the presentation, and then we'll save a lot of time at the end for questions and perhaps more comments or reactions and thoughts. So with that, let me begin. And so one of the things that we've had, particularly those of us that have the lived experience of using technology in our career, is that we're at a different time and place. And so we'll begin tonight by going back and looking at some of the historical developments in special ed. And those of us that lived through that, hopefully this will spark some additional memories that you might want to share or comments you might want to make. But we're going to use that to segue into what's happening in classrooms currently and kind of see the historical roots of some of the things that we've said over the last 30 years. And then I'd like to end by trying to be provocative, and I'll let you judge if I'm provocative enough, but I want to paint a picture of some futures that may look drastically different than what we're experiencing now. And unfortunately, I think they're profound and they may be upsetting, but I think part of a leadership organization is to kind of anticipate some of those changes and to think about what that might mean. So I hope you enjoy that. So again, if you'll post questions as we go along, and I'll stop, and Paula will kind of moderate those during the presentation, but then we'll stop at the end for questions. The other thing I want to share with you is kind of a filter. The challenge of seeing the forest through the trees is because we live through this and we pick up a new app once a month, or we're using technology all day and we think everybody in the world is now on Zoom, we often lose sight of the bigger picture. So part of what I want to do is to drill in and to focus, but I also want to step back. And so if I'm successful tonight, I'm hoping you'll see some themes or patterns. And I hope it might look obvious after I say it, so that might actually be a good thing. But I find that in technology, we kind of wake up and say, how did we get there? What happened? And it's because the incremental change is just going so close, and we're just seeing that we kind of discard or miss the bigger picture. So I find this metaphor of the forest through the trees to be very useful. All right. Part one here is, let me introduce you to some significant historical developments. Any of us, we can argue that was significant or not. And so given the shortness of time, I can't deeply explore everything, but let me share a couple of things with you to see what you think about these historical foundations. One of the most important frames that I want to share with you tonight is that the field of special education is really considered an early adopter of technology. We were among the first looking and trying to use microcomputers in the classroom. And the reason being is that many within our profession recognize that this box, this stuff, offered something for people with disabilities that we couldn't do before, that they couldn't interact with their environment, that they could find new ways of showing potential. So this, I think, is a very important historical theme for CEC to consider, that we are special in this case, but it is, we're not late to the party of technology. These next few screens are excerpts of an article I was able to write with Ed Blackhurst when the new century started. So this was published in 2000. And what Ed and I did is notice the rows across the screen. We identified 6 topics of things that might be relevant in terms of technology and special education. And then within those timelines, we dropped in particular events. And so I kind of like this graphic, particularly for the 100th anniversary, and that box has a number of source documents that Ed and I used. But I want to start by pointing out that historically that we had some really kind of basic things, and you see some dates here that really kind of anchor us to the way early in society's development about technology and what it could be used for. So we'll kind of use that frame and go through a couple different decades. But I think some other important things that lay the foundation for us today is the American Printing House was opened in 1879. 1834, Braille was invented, is still relevant today. 1874, a device called the autophone bone conduction amplifier was invented that allowed us to gain some hearing from bone conduction. Typewriter was invented, which we all know is the founding of the keyboard and things. So anyway, there's some interesting things that made possible later in the 20th century because of earlier work. So now skipping a whole bunch of years, we end up in the 1980s. This is where things started to heat up. Something very notable in our field is Jackie Brand, who was a parent of a child with a disability, created a network in California where parents and kids could get together and use computers. That became a national model that later became known as the Alliance for Technology Access. And so you're going to see one of the themes we talk about is how important parents are in driving our work. There's another couple, Bud and Dolores Hagen, parents of a child with a hearing impairment in Minneapolis area. They created this whole organization that still continues today, known as Closing the Gap, has an annual conference and a resource guide and a very rich website. In a few minutes, we'll talk about this adaptive firmware card. This was really something very, very significant, so I'll wait to talk about that. And I think it's important as we look at technology and society that back in the early 80s, the most common way of getting new software was wait for your magazine to show up in the mail, and then you could copy the type of the magazine into your computer. So the code is typed in the magazine, and you get to retype it into your own computer and save it, and then you run it. And that's always an experience in terms of making sure you didn't have any typos. And so we learn about debugging and stuff like that. But anyway, that seems very foreign for some of our younger teachers. It's like, what? So, all right, staying within that decade, we saw the first Closing the Gap conference. The Technology and Media Division was recognized by CEC in 1984. They held their first conference. We see common tools. If you're in the classroom back then, you were using things like Math Shop, Math Blasters, Writing to Read, and something called AppleWorks. This was all before 1984 when we introduced our first Macintosh. And back in 1982, the Time Magazine Person of the Year was named the computer. The computer was named Man of the Year in 1983. So we were really hot on ourselves about all these great advances and what was ahead of us. Creeping ahead just a little bit, it continues to heat up in the late 80s. Special education, again, is a leader. We were using something called bulletin boards to communicate, and we had groups. So if you were a special education administrator, you could go on and join that. Bev and I were involved in the behavior disorders message board of SpecialNet. Greg Vanderheiden was running a center at Trace, and they were creating tools that you could send families to, and they'd evaluate and figure out what kinds of specialized tools the kids would need to access the computer. Research and development group getting an OSEP grant at Johns Hopkins created this MAX, multi-sensory authoring communication system, because they realized some of our kids needed such specialized development. And so this was one of the first authoring systems where you didn't have to know programming. The teachers just opened this up, put in content, saved it, and now you had interactive learning activities for kids. Very revolutionary, very exciting. You'd get 2 floppy disks and you could have this software yourself. So very big deal at conferences, go and get these disks. As early as 1986, Apple was putting out a brochure about special education and the way software could unlock potential for individuals with disabilities. And again, we start to see the emergence of some textbooks and things in this space. Some other things that happened is that in 1987, OSEP established a special funding program called the Technology Media Materials Program that gave us dedicated avenues for getting funding. Congress passed the Technology Assistance Act. It was commonly known as the Tech Act. The brilliance of this is that it eventually would lead to a single source of contact in all 50 states. So people with disabilities could find out, how do you get this stuff? CEC got in on the action because they received a grant to establish the National Center for Special Education Technology. So now we had a national clearinghouse for this. Free software continues. There was this product called Fred Writer, which again, a floppy disk, and you can get this free word processor and type stuff and make it come out on your printer. And most of us on this would realize the advantage of the backspace key, the undo button. The 1986 publication of Muppet Learning Keys was another milestone because it was a separate keyboard that we could give to young children where the alphabet was in alphabetical order. And so it made it possible now to teach some basic computer literacy to children as young as kindergarten, as well as students with cognitive impairments. And so very, very important access tool back in the late 90s. As the century closed out, we see more evolution. Most importantly for our work today is that 1999, CAST was awarded a 5-year grant to design a more universally accessible curriculum. Inclusion was gearing up, and we're trying to figure out how we get access to the general ed curriculum. And so this really was the foundation of their work in terms of what turned out to be universal design for learning. Again, federally funded and supported by starting in special education. We start to do some work in the area of competencies. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The Eric OSEP project released a booklet that summarized some of the CAST principles called A Curriculum Every Student Can Use. And that really probably seeded the environment in terms of understanding a need for universal design for learning. And then some other things happening is that America Online purchased Netscape. And then a couple of years later, they were going to buy Time Warner. And this little startup called Amazon was getting started. So hopefully what this does is give you some kind of basic overview of some of the things we've been doing. And then again, those of us who have lived through that, you may remember little bits and pieces of that. But let me stop and ask Paula if there's any questions in the chat before we go to section 2.
You know,
okay, if there's none
we're
now,
in
we
good
can.
shape. We're in good shape, Dave.
Okay. Well, we can talk more at the end, but I do hope that trip down memory lane will inspire you maybe to share some observations of what you saw in schools or things you saw that in this next section, we're going to talk about how do we connect those foundations to what's happening in classrooms around the country. So let's focus on this. Now, some of you are in classrooms every day, so this is not particularly interesting because you're seeing this, but for the rest of us that are a little bit removed, I think it's important to talk about what classrooms look like and what's happening. So technology is in schools. There is a digital divide. Classrooms are not all equally outfitted with technology. So let's kind of step through some of the things. And again, what I'm trying to work on here are some themes that have come out of the historical foundations. And so an OSEP secretary named Judy Heumann is quoted as saying that for most people, technology makes things easier. And those of us that word process can completely appreciate that versus when we had to type manuscripts with our typewriter and start all over because of the errors. But she said for people with disabilities, technology makes things possible. And so she makes a stark contrast between the rest of us who are spending less time doing things because it's easier, and then this dependency we have on technology that's the only way I can do it, but at least I now have one way that I can do this. So one of the milestones in CEC's history in 1984, these two articles came out of a special issue of Exceptional Children. So as early as 1984, we had recognized that this technology stuff was going to be something special. So you see the first article on the left that talks about really, hey, there's all this potential. Let me tell you some of the ways you can use this to teach kids about computers and memory and the future. And then the closing article is this promises and pitfalls, which is the traditional hyping to bring it back to reality, to say that we do tend to overhype and overexpect, and that there are going to be some problems. But the point was, our profession had adopted this and elevated the conversation as early as 1984 that says that technology has a place in special education. So I think we see that in classrooms today, although we still may be struggling to fully implement it and to robustly embrace it. There's still teachers sometimes that come out of our preparation programs that say, I'm a good teacher, I don't need technology. Although that conversation is getting less and less, it is really important. And we'll see this amplified in the context of federal policy that does have a strong disposition that students with disabilities should be using technology, and that we need to consider AT when we make each IEP. So anyway, one of the important themes that technology is really not optional for people with disabilities. Another aspect of this is our field is very dependent on our smart colleagues that engineer stuff. So the photo you see on the left is a close-up example of what's called the adaptive firmware card. And this was invented in the late 70s and became widespread in the 80s when we could produce them. And if you had a disability and couldn't use the keyboard, we would install this card in your Apple II computer, and then that goofy looking cord on the right that comes out of the card got the box at the bottom to the outside of your computer. And we would use those prongs or those jacks to plug in other devices. So we could demonstrate that a kid that could only press a switch or another kind of alternative input could now run the whole computer. They could word process. They could make signs for their locker using print shop. They could be gainfully employed, by doing data entry and things. So very brilliant solution to think that there's other ways to get information in the computer. Now, again, this required a considerable evaluation to say, okay, which input method is best for you, and what do we have to have in place for you? But again, that's part of our secret sauce as a profession, is that we know how to use these devices, we know how to assess, and we can do this job of trying to get this technology to work for somebody that may have a very contorted body that we would typically write off to say, well, you're not employable, you can't do things. Jumping to the photo in the top right is an example of what was called the IntelliKeys keyboard. The significance of this is it was programmable. You can't really tell, but that keyboard there slips out of the frame. So what happens is we could make a keyboard that just has a right and a left, divided all in half, and one says yes and the other says no. And I could just hit it with my whole arm and tell the computer yes or no. Very exciting time in the 1990s as we tried to customize the children's interaction with the technology. The bottom right photo is a screen print enlarged of word prediction. And this is now where we codify English language syntax and try and predict based on the existing words, what word's going to come next. So the sample here is word prediction helps me. And as I type S, P, it starts guessing it's going to be some variation of spell. And so we could then just click one button to have that word completed. Today we know this about texting, that the essence of texting is word prediction, which is another good example of universal design for learning, that what started as an assistive technology for some of us had such value that it could be good for all of us. And so again, as we look at these kind of applications in general society, it's really important to help our colleagues remember that it got started in our space in special education. Historically, special education is about specialized instruction. And so back in the 80s, you would get software from floppy disks. And so one of the first mass selling software products was something called the DLM Academic Skill Builder. And what you see in the lower right is an example of Alien Edition. Your job was to move left to right there at the bottom and put in the answers. So 6 plus 7 would be 13. You'd enter that and press the space bar. It would blast that alien, and then you could go to the next one. And the idea was you clear off all the aliens before they got to you, and you go up levels and things like that. And at the time, we thought this was helping kids learn their math facts. There was some ability to customize the problem set. So if you just wanted kids to work on the 5s or the 1s, you could limit that and do that. So this was very widely adopted. And so this notion of students with disabilities, what tools do we have to customize instruction? And today now we see this pretty much in anything in the Office suite. So we can use Word and PowerPoint. We can substitute out other tools. So if they can't use Word, we can use Co-Writer. We could use Clicker. And so this notion that whatever the function is of the classroom, we can find appropriate software and build in the specialized supports. So if you need word prediction or spelling checking or other kinds of tools, that is really part of our DNA. Everybody's familiar with the accessibility challenges. Again, Greg Vander Heiden, he realized when they couldn't meet all the people lined up outside their doors in Madison, that rather than doing individual evaluation, he came up with the insight that, well, what if we load control panels on every machine? And now you just have to go in and turn them on. And so what you see here is a screen print. I think this is from a Macintosh, but you have a set of accessibility control panels and you just go navigate there on the left for what function the individual's having. Now, again, this jumps ahead to universal design because it's already loaded and that any of us who need it. So I might have a disability, I might have a temporary impairment from an accident or illness, or I might be aging and I need my type much bigger. So what we do is then we teach people, we advocate for saying, hey, there's some features here that can make you more effective or to enhance your performance without the eye strain. You can't spell? Let me teach you how to dictate to your computer. That would not only help people who are blind and want to do text input, but it would help our students with learning disabilities that get tripped on the spelling construction of their language. Greg's work was very instrumental in helping the computer industry adopt accessibility control panels that have been released since the 1990s on every computer that's shipped around the world. Over to the right, you see, and many of you may know the W3C consortium, known as the Web Accessibility Initiative, and where we advocate for the accessible web design, recognizing very early on that if we made web pages that aren't accessible, people with disabilities wouldn't be able to access the same information as everybody else. And actually, that has become a universal solution that once we design web pages properly, we can not only make it accessible cognitively, but we can also make them multilingual. We can use simplified English. And so a whole variety of supports can be done if we understand those principles. Obviously, there's still a gap between the potential of these tools and the fact how widely they're known or used, or the kinds of web design errors we're still making when it's not accessible. But again, this is an ongoing issue. This problem came to the forefront during the pandemic, as teachers were giving students PDF-based assignments and the PDFs were not accessible. Nobody had bothered to test them ahead of time, and all of a sudden students are saying, hey, I can't access that. So the pandemic helped us understand a lot of unmet assistive technology needs because students were trying to access this on their home computer, and nobody had ever done an accessibility check. Early on, we learned that parents are a huge driver, that parents saw potential of technology, didn't want their children left behind. And so eventually this got the attention of OSEP. So we have regional parent training and information centers that will help parents navigate both the IEP process, but how to get information on different products. We have a parent, Candice Cordiella, that created the Advocacy Institute that works not only with parents, but also with parents' attorneys. So again, just doing the right thing isn't enough sometimes. They need a little bit more leverage. So this notion that we have a clearinghouse to help parents keep the pressure up on school districts so their children can get what they need. This is part of our DNA as a profession. Another giant theme in our work is the notion of personnel preparation. Ed Blackhurst is a giant in this space. So very early in 1986, he wrote the article on the left, microcomputer use in special ed personnel prep, noticing that teacher ed had to do business differently to integrate this kind of work, what kind of competencies teachers would need to be able to use this stuff in the classroom. And then recognizing what became Project Retool is that we needed to spend some money training university faculty, because if they didn't have the skill set, then their students would leave without the skills. And so defining the competencies that university faculty. So again, this is very important that we recognize there's probably at least 20 dissertations written a year on this, about the competencies that teachers perceive or that they have or they don't have. And so this has been an ongoing challenge for our profession to make sure people have the skill sets to use what's already available in the marketplace. Related to this is the standards work that CEC has done. Many of you may know that the purple book there on the left has replaced the historical red book, where they've been formulating the standards for the preparation of future special educators. In my subfield, we did quite a bit of work through TAM. Liz Lam led us in terms of the assistive technology competencies, not only for AT specialists, but for classroom teachers. So we validated competencies that then contributed to the purple book. There's been another effort out there by an engineering group known as RESNA, and they felt that we had to pursue a certification licensure approach. So they run a standardized test, costs I think around $700 to sit for it, but they will argue then you could be a certified credentialed provider of professional providing AT services. This has become a somewhat divisive issue in our field related to legal challenges. Because many of our school-based AT professionals do not have a certification. And so if we go get a third-party evaluation by an ATP, then we kind of have a problem if there's a debate about what a child needs. But again, their approach is that they think we have to improve our practice through standards, licensing, and testing. And so that's been their approach. And we're probably at least 12 years into that model. So it's well established. Naturally, we have a significant research base for our work. The article at the top was written in the 1980s, where they're trying to understand computer-based instruction. And then more recently in the late 90s, this article by John Woodward and Herb Reith was published in the Review of Educational Research. So considered one of the top research journals that we finally broke through with having a good empirical literature review. So this work was all going on before we really started talking a lot about an evidence-based. But however, one of the problems is because there are so many forms of technology, so many types of disabilities, overall our research base is not what it needs to be in terms of a evidence-based practice. So there's only a few examples of things we can point to that has a strong evidence base. And so there's an ongoing tension in our work about the difference for research to say, hey, this works, and the difference between innovation to say, hey, nobody's done this before, look what I made, and you should try it. And so an ongoing problem for us, how do we reconcile the need for innovation to solve problems versus to say, hey, we shouldn't be doing that if there's not an evidence base. Most importantly, anytime we have a profession, we can start talking about a community. And so Closing the Gap has created kind of a practitioner community that we follow. Down at the bottom, there's something called QUIET, Quality Indicators of Assistive Technology Services. They created a listserv that is over 20 years old, and it has become the standard community of practice, if you will, for our field. One of the ISU graduates, Brian Wojcik, did a dissertation studying a qualitative study of the QUIET listserv in terms of the kinds of questions that are posed and how the community of practice dealt with that and shared their practical insights. So a very strong resource for us working in this space. Assistive technology industry was formed in the late 1990s. This is all the vendors that come together. They sponsor a conference each January in Orlando that, again, is very attractive to those in the Midwest with snow. But to go down there and then to learn and keep up on our skills as well as see the latest kinds of products. And then the original TAM that was created in 1984 has rebranded itself as the Innovations in Special Ed Technology. So this is the division within CEC that helps us learn about technology and advocates for the use of both AT and UDL in the classroom. Another way of looking at community is I used a tool that some of you might be interested in called the Wayback Machine. The Wayback Machine is made by some people in California, and they literally back up the internet every night. Let me pause to let that sink in. They back up the internet every night. So, so this is a tool that we can go back and see what web pages look like. So I put in the CEC URL, and this is what it looked like when it was launched on December 22nd, 1996. When you click on that little continue button, it brings up this menu, which again looks very similar to today in terms of how we navigate. But that's what it looked like when we got started. So it's like, wait, we're one of among the first professional associations to have a web page. A couple years later, by 1998, it looked like this, which I find really gorgeous in terms of the color contrast and the sections on the left there. But this, again, is an advanced framework for how we interact and work with the web today. And our professional association was there helping us understand how this tool could be used and how we can all connect and share information. Paula mentioned that I was editor of TEC, and one of the things I did back then is I brought in some associate editors, Randy Boone and Kyle Higgins, and their job was to help me think about digital publishing. And so in 1998, we had the first issue that was simultaneously published on the web as well as in print. And that was really a remarkable touch point for CEC. Today, it doesn't seem so amazing, but I also want to show you that there was a downturn, that if we jump ahead to a publisher like the Hamill Institute and Sage, what we see here at the bottom is kind of a paywall system that, yes, you can find my article, but you have to pay to get in. And so what happens is that this notion of digital publishing came to represent trafficking in PDFs. So basically, we just have a PDF that doesn't have anything special. No, some PDFs will have links that are embedded, but what we envisioned back with Randy and Kyle was links and articles that had multimedia, so that we can show you a movie when we talk about how the intervention worked in a classroom. We had teacher lesson plans, we had resource guides, we had links of tools you could use, and all of that's been lost, because the scholarly communication now is the transmittal and business aspect of selling PDFs. So anyway, I show this an example. Again, the scholarly communication, our teachers have access to all of this through any simple website or through Google Scholar. So again, we found the roots, but now it's so common that we have a different problem called information overload. So it's very challenging. I want to end this section naturally on the pandemic. I mentioned that we created a problem of unrecognized, undiagnosed AT needs. We're discovering all this curricula we have, even though it's digital, it's not really accessible. We're finding some content management systems aren't accessible or supportive. They're not helpful in terms of monitoring student progress. They're just containers. So a number of things have exposed weaknesses in our professional work. The federal government and the industry itself has noticed we have cybersecurity issues. We're not at great risk, but the point is that these systems are not as secure as they need to be. And so if people wanted to get in and do things, as we saw with early on with Zoom bombing, where people are breaking into our Zoom connections. But currently we're struggling with the issue of learning loss, is that we're trying to make sense of what's happened over the last couple of years. We're admitting grudgingly that there's been some loss and the gains are not what we would typically expect. And then the past year, we've seen the U.S. Department of Education and Congress fund a number of initiatives to the tune of $122 billion, which is about 3 times the size of Title I funding, called the American Rescue Plan, which gives as a priority the purchase of content management systems, investments in cybersecurity, AT training, AT devices, purchase of internet access for homes. And so very large blank check for us to address the structural inequities in our local school system. So again, if anybody wants to talk more about that, I'd be happy to. I've done some work in that space and trying to help people understand how much money is available and how you can access it. So let me take a pause and ask Paula, any questions in the chat that we should chat about before we move on?
Well, there were some interesting comments, Dave, about things like teachers needing computers, and even in the mid-90s. That surprised me, Cariana. Do you want to say a word about that?
It was interesting that the district had kind of an initiative for general ed to have computers or access to computers, but special ed did not get any of that.
Surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I had to really argue and fight that my students needed it more than other students.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, but there's something else that happened. Do you remember that we always used to have to go to the computer room?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was computing was a place. It was special, right? And so then when we started releasing them to the classroom, you could have 1, maybe you could have 3, and then eventually we said 1-to-1. Let's put them on a cart and make sure there's 30 in your room. And so you see this evolution that where technology became more accessible, but as we deploy it, we still didn't give up some of our original thinking that this is special. We have to protect it. And certain kids, especially I remember in behavior disorders, we couldn't give it to those kids because they were going to throw it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they may be the most needy for self-regulation and things like that. So yeah, great comment, great observation.
Oh my goodness, there's so many good comments, Dave. One, Bev is still using what did you say there in Cuba?
Lonnie and I were in Cuba about 3 years ago, before the pandemic, and the schools, they had one. Each of the schools had one, the old Apple IIe computers. That was it.
Yeah. Well, there's still a lot of communities that are collecting old computers, thinking we could take them to third world countries. But there's other countries that are saying we don't want your junk because the smartphones, you know, what I have in my pocket is more powerful than that Apple computer. So yeah.
Yeah. And Jim, your comment is about accessibility, is it not? Evidence-based versus non-evidence-based, always been a false dichotomy. Talk about that, Jim. We have time.
Well, I thought Dave's comment was really interesting in terms of when you're talking about trying to build an evidence base up about it versus people trying to be innovative. And in some ways, it hasn't been a terrible wrong turn for the field, but I think in some ways this idea that you can divide things into practices that are evidence-based and those that are not evidence-based, and what we need are teachers to have this warehouse of knowledge so that they can go choose the evidence-based ones out. It is maybe a bit of a wrong way of thinking. I'd rather have teachers who are problem solvers, who can diagnose a problem and then say, you know, yeah, here are some things that may work, they're likely to work, and then are data-based. So for that child, collect
Sure.
data and see if you know, it has worked or not. So it's just a bit of a support of what you're saying. You know, the search for the great evidence-based trove, and I know no one has said it exactly like that, but sometimes I think it's a bit misguided.
Yeah, Jim, good observation, because I think you're exactly right. Especially when it comes to apps, you know, the app just got into the App Store because we finished it yesterday, and so there is no evidence base. And so yeah, you are experimenting with my child, but at a certain level, we know if it's about language development, we can drop back to the evidence based about vocabulary development or peer-to-peer communication. So I do think there's some strategies, and I like your approach that, you know, special ed, we do have a data-based orientation, which is single subject. We can get the evidence that it works for this child. And so I think there's some tactics about that, but it means we have to be more nuanced in our conversation and more direct in our skill development to help that. But it's also an educational problem that we can't just wave a magic wand and then, you know, these administrators just want to blindly say, okay, that's the rule. And so if the vendor can't give me the evidence base, we can't buy it, which is where I get called in a lot. You know, it's like, how do we deal with this? So
Excellent, Dave, that's it. On you go with future.
Okay. Good. Well, and then this will go quick, and then we'll have more conversation time. This is where I want to try to be provocative, and so feel free to disagree with me. But let me paint a future about where we're at and where we could go, and let me explain how I got there. So we're going to talk about three kinds of futures, and we'll start with the near future. And so what the futurists call this is transition from current to future, like next week or next month or next year. We call that incremental change. And the point is, we can see evidence right now that likely it's going to go in this direction and become very common. And so if you're coming to the bank asking for a loan because you want to, you know, make a business to do X, chances are we're all going to agree to give you that money because we can kind of all see it going in that direction. Okay, so let me give you some examples of what that might look like. These come from an article I published in Exceptional Children. And so some are a little dated, but let me give you the flavor of what this means. As one is, we've been trying to talk about the decreasing cost. Now that Chromebooks are under $200, it wasn't hard to imagine in 2013 when I wrote this, that we'd get to the point that every student had their own Chromebook. That what was starting out as special of one-to-one initiatives that some schools or some classrooms
Oh, Dave, we're not hearing you, Dave.
Oh,
No, we got you again.
okay. It said that
We were at Chromebooks, Dave. We were at Chromebooks when we stopped hearing you. At least I stopped hearing you.
I did.
Yes. after all that, I got a message saying my connection was unstable. So, okay, so I was at the first one there about digital learning devices. And so anyway, this has kind of come true with the pandemic, that the children have Chromebooks. And if they don't, we could use federal money now to buy every student a device. We can also buy devices for home. That's an allowable expense. The second one, digitalization, this has also come true in the pandemic, that we foresaw from CAST's work that curricula is easier to update and distribute if it's digital rather than print, and that we have to send it somewhere to get a modification. So this notion that digital delivery of curriculum means kids are going to spend more time on computers, or the curriculum will be digitized and we'll buy it through subscription instead of textbooks. Again, not a big change. And then finally, all of us are understanding the difference now of these computer-based systems that are collecting data about us. They know how much I'm on, what links I click on. They're connecting my data with other databases, like from Facebook or credit cards. They're customizing my advertising. They're compromising my privacy. Now, in our context, what this means is all this data about what a child does could inform a smarter IEP. That all this data could be come in and crunched and said, look, Dave needs to rack up more minutes every day reading. That could be, because again, just as our whole lifestyle becomes more digital, these digital streams of data. So anyway, I don't find these very interesting. Some of you might think I'm very smart to observe these, but these are trends that are out there right now. They're easy to see, and we can kind of play with, well, what if this keeps continuing? What if it scales? The reason they're not very interesting is that they're single trends. So let me move to the second approach, which is incremental change with convergence. And what this means now is that two trends hit together. They come together in a way that accelerate change. So Amazon, the two that they put together was e-commerce selling you books. And that was really revolutionary when they got started. But what they realized is there's lots of other trends they could put together, and it becomes, as we'll talk about in a second. Now, here's what's important to know about this is not everybody can see these relationships. And so you're kind of special if you're connecting the dots, because you've got a head start because not everybody else sees it. And yet this is the kind of thing that people say, man, I wish I invested in Amazon way back when. So there is a role for many of us as professionals, because I don't have to know a lot. I just have to connect the dots in a certain way. So watch what happens if I connect two trends, like we want more engaged learning, and I'm going to give you mobile devices. Well, now what this means is learning doesn't have to occur in the classroom. We could change how schools look, because we have these devices you can learn anywhere, like outside or in the field in science, etc. Okay, so not very interesting. Here's another one that is more interesting to me, is the fact our students are more diverse linguistically and culturally. But what if we married those demographics with pedagogical agents who were also culturally sensitive? Could we do different kind of prompting and guiding? Could we create new pathways for tutoring instead of the one size fits all? And again, if you like that idea, we can take that to the bank, right? And see if we can get a loan and create our business. A third one was about the teacher shortage in online learning. This is coming to a head right now as we have teachers leaving, as we struggle with the pandemic about whether we're going back to classrooms and stuff. And so what happens here, I predicted in 2013, is that this is going to expand because of teacher shortages. And we have lots of data to say teacher prep can't continue to fill the pipeline. So this could mean something. Again, what it looks like, I don't know. But again, what I'm trying to do is to model for you how we play with ideas, and then could create something that could make a different kind of future. All right, well, here's the third one. This is where I really want to be provocative. There's a third kind called disruptive change. And here's the problem we have with Amazon, Google, Wikipedia. We could never predict those in advance. And so the reason these next examples are going to become disruptive is it's not because they're the first, like Tesla. They weren't the first to market with an electric car, but they achieved market dominance because the rules of the game have changed. and everybody else is still playing by the old rules. So Amazon, while we thought they were selling us books, they were changing the rules about what e-commerce and delivery could look like. And because of that, the rest of us couldn't catch up. And what makes these so disruptive is this is a future we can't readily see. So let me give you two examples here. Well, what if I have digital learning devices and I'm really concerned about engaged learning and I'm using big data and it's online? You know what this might look like? Daily attendance at school becomes optional. We use the web, the digitalized curriculum materials, the time on task is all monitored. I could have new pathways to being finished. I could graduate high school in 1 year instead of 4. I could go, instead of going to school, I could go to Starbucks or a community center where then I have a social gathering and a safe place, but I also do my work, which is what many adults do. They park themselves in Starbucks and work the morning. Wow. Now, here's a different one. We got aging faculty at the universities. We have teacher shortages in the schools. We're concerned about the quality of teachers. I'm hearing stories about teachers with a high school degree can now teach special ed. That's being okayed in some states. But if we add in a dose of universal design for learning and we add a dose of learning analytics and we create massively open online courses, guess what? Now I don't need special ed teachers, because what I've done is I've created specialized interventions that are built into my interface and into my curricula of online courses that provide interactive feedback, real-time performance monitoring, branching on your performance, and daily evaluation by the learning analytics. Far more than any individual teacher can do, even though we say we're doing individualized instruction. What concerns me is this scenario is becoming pretty close to true. Now, we're not there yet, but what you see is the convergence of trends are becoming ripe for saying, we're not going to reopen a school. We're going to do it online, or we're going to do these other models. So this is what makes disruptive change so interesting and provocative. It's a convergence of trends. It's not waiting for technology that's not invented. We're going to bring all these together in a way that nobody else has thought of to solve a problem that is going to have a big, big market. Now, I want to conclude here by telling you this has already happened in special ed. We have our own case study in disruption. And what you see in the center there, that little keyboard with a little screen, is an augmentative communication device that until recently cost $7,500. And that company was put out of business by the software app on the right for the iPhone called Proloquo to Go. And this is a communication system that you buy for $200 and you customize the app and the communication. I won't say the same as the $7,500 device, but it's got a lot more flexibility that I don't need a specialized person to load my vocabulary. So here's another example where the developers saw, mobile devices, easier software development tools, an unmet market in terms of people that needed more communication tools, and that the $7,500 wasn't viable. There wasn't enough insurance companies paying for it, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, interesting example if you want to talk about this more. But let me share 3 more ideas just to show you some of the things that weren't in the tables. We're struggling with personalization. One of my concerns here is this could eliminate special education. If we codify what we think of personalization as an algorithm that then creates custom content by drawing it, or creates custom pathways, or dynamically alters the feedback or the support we give you in the guise of getting you to the level of performance that we want. Right now, this is the Achilles heel of special education. We've been really good about getting kids into special ed. We don't have the data that we're getting them out with skills appropriate to their peers. So I'm really concerned about this kind of rationale for a new future. Second, many of you are familiar with automation and making jobs obsolete. Initially, I thought this just applied to our kids in transition programs that were being taught to work in fast food restaurants, that those jobs would be eliminated. More recently, my thinking's been altered because of the arguments being made that white collar positions are going to be eliminated, as such positions as lawyers, professors, and teachers. And the Susskind book is very provocative in this sense. And we could talk more about this if you'd like, but if you just think about what your life has been like going from an accountant to doing your taxes with TurboTax, and the number of accountants that has displaced, Susskind is arguing that that work is coming to teachers, that we can teach a computer to know the curriculum and then to parse it out, which leads me to my final dot, is that there's a new set of technologies that are known as computational knowledge. And if you're not familiar with this, it's things like Alexa and Siri and self-driving vehicles, but you can also go look at Wolfram Alpha. This is a tool you could actually use with your students. And what it does is you type in a question and it answers you in text, in graphic form, and text, graphic, and a third one, interactive maybe. Anyway, but here's the point, is that all of our knowledge has been digitized. Wikipedia, social media, research journals are all being fed into these engines, and they're acquiring information, and now they'll just do a search. They'll look for connections, and as we build it with artificial intelligence, then it's going to spit out things that obviously would be wrong to start with, but the machines are going to get faster and smarter because they're processing and discerning patterns. They believe that this is going to lead to a breakthrough. We've seen some of this in terms of the pandemic, but things like cancer, because our doctors can't read all the new journal articles about cancer research. And so we're ingesting these source documents into systems, and they're trying to diagnose and discern treatments for cancer at a level far more sophisticated than the humans. Now, again, it's still subject to human checking, but I think this is a metaphor for what's going to happen to special education. As we digitize all of our special ed textbooks, and we add it to these other kinds of systems, it's going to be a provocative change. In conclusion, my scenarios may or may not come true, so that's not my point. I'm just trying to challenge us to think about. The point is the future may be very different than the past. And certainly as I read about AI and the future of computational knowledge, that's going to be a challenge. Challenge for all of us as leaders is to discern the trends that are going to be short-lived and maybe insignificant from the changes that are going to be profound. Again, as we hear about a universal basic income, that political message is being put out there because how do I get income if my job gets eliminated? And if we're going to eliminate white collar jobs, what does that mean for the students we work with who are at entry-level jobs that are going to be eliminated? I find this to be a huge issue that we have to address. And then finally, amid all the pandemic and the chaos, there is opportunity. So it is important we have innovators and thoughtful people try to make sense of all this. And I think that's one of the lessons as a field. Not only do we adopt technologies, but we play in the innovation space. So let me stop and let's open it up for questions, comments, and reactions, thoughts.
Yeah. Goodness, Dave. Fascinating. Would you be so kind as to give the Susskind reference, if you'd be so?
We can make the event, the slideshow available to you.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so we can
Yeah.
but here,
Word
here
without
it is.
word. That's absolutely amazing. And Cariana, you're not buying some of this, are you?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. I remember earlier in the talk, you pointed out how much parents advocate, right? And how much change has happened because of parents. And so I would just question whether the disruption of kids being taught fully online would ever come to fruition, because during the pandemic, in many districts, they were the only ones that were face-to-face.
Exactly. I think it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's going to happen because the financial pressures.
See,
So
I wonder if before that happens, what it will be is it will be teachers being educated fully online and less of a rigorous program so that they can push teachers through.
I think that's going to be the case. I think we'll see more just-in-time training because, again, if all of a sudden a high school educated person is now a teacher, it is like, okay, it's crisis management just in
Yeah.
time. You know, they can't sit through a 3 credits behavior management course.
Yeah, right.
So
Right.
you know, again, I think it'll be downsizing our work into modules and smaller units. And no, you're exactly right. But again, you know, whether this stuff happens at all or if it happens incrementally, you know, we'll see. But what I'm concerned about now is the pieces are in place.
Yeah.
You know, that's the context. And so, you know, again, maybe not 100% of kids with disabilities be online, but they could wave a magic wand and we can get 95% of them. You know, not saying it's better education, but that's our preferred service model because there's a shortage. You know,
Right.
like, oh, you know, so that's my concern about the future is we kind of keep thinking, oh, it'll change a little bit. Wait, this could be really profound.
Mhm.
Now, Dave, there's another question here. What advice would you provide to professors in teacher prep programs now, like initial licensure and endorsement? Have you any thoughts on that?
I'm really inspired by the comment made by John Hattie, you know, that compiled all the meta-analyses about what works. And he said that an effective teacher is one that, kind of going back to Jim Thompson's comment about effectiveness, is let me go today with what I know works, but it's not going to work for everybody. So my homework tonight is to go find something else and bring it back tomorrow. And so he really argues that effective teachers are R&D people. Is I try it, do the best I can. If it doesn't work, my job is to go find something else that works. And I keep coming back to the classroom, trying stuff. It strikes me, if that's my disposition, that I get in front of the kids every day and say, hey guys, I don't know if you're gonna like this, but let's try it out. I make them co-developers of R&D. That you know, we're trying this. And so, you know, if you don't like PowerPoint, let me show you Google Slides, or let me show you Prezi, or let me show you, you know, I can make 10 versions of PowerPoint that are out there. And I can teach the kids to go look for them. But my point is, at the end of the week, they have to do a presentation. But I don't really care what platform they use, because that's the essence of lifelong learning. The tools will change. The support I need, how I do it, which ones I like. Well, you know, I used to like PowerPoint, but now I like the cloud. You know, so I use, you know, this. That to me is inoculating people, not to be future-proof, but it's inoculating them to the negative aspects of change. Because I don't get locked in that, you know, I know PowerPoint, I'm good for life. It doesn't work that way anymore.
Right. You have to have a theoretical foundation, and you have to know and problem solve and think and have a basis for thinking anew, etc. A nice comment here, Dave, that kind of supports what you're saying is, I think that these changes will provide great opportunities for experienced teachers sharing their knowledge with other teachers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, right on. And I think that goes back to, you know, the importance of community. You know, how do we use these systems? Hey, I see some people signing off, and I know we're over time, so let me throw this slide up. I went through a lot. If you want the PowerPoint, ask Paula or myself. There's my email address. I've got a set of little articles that I'd be happy to send you if you're interested in reading, you know, fuller comments than what I tried to give in a Cliff Notes version. But I'd be happy to share things with people if they want. So if you want to, tell you what, I'll put my email address in the chat, but if you want to grab that, and then I'd be very happy to follow up with anybody if they're so inclined.
Thank you so much, Dave. I'm seeing lots of thank yous and lots of compliments, and I'm delighted you joined us tonight. And between the two of us, we'll respond to any questions or any requests for further information. And thank you so much for being here. And what a provocative presentation. And you know, we're enriched and we've new ways to think about what's going on around us, right? Lots of thank yous, expansive and interesting presentation, it's called, Dave. So very nice.
I can stay a few minutes if anybody wants to talk more, or if Paula's available for a few minutes.
Yeah, well, very good. Any other pressing comments, or just unmute yourself and jump in? Interesting, Lindsay, you in transition, Lindsay Palak Sheldon is a transition specialist, and my goodness, I never heard of white collar worker, you know, disappearing, not just, you know, the things we see automated so frequently. Now that does send us thinking anew, perhaps again.
Yeah, all those higher level skills. I mean, could you imagine
You know,
wiping that away?
we think we're irreplaceable for that. And again, so even if we only start with the bad teachers, right? But the point is, once we go down that path, there are going to be less and less opportunities. And yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. And if you think about the diagnostic part of our work and you know, the troubleshooting we do about where kids have errors and what they're doing, the machine is going to get smarter about that than we could do. You know, it's just like that's, you know, good and bad, I guess, but it's yeah.
Yeah, it is so fascinating when you make a telephone call these days and no, that's not what you want. So now try again. You know, those phone calls that say things like, try again. So is it this that you want? No, I think it might be this that you want. You know, it's like, oh my goodness.
That does remind us it may not be tomorrow, but the point is they're working on it, right? And they're you know, we're training those systems to get smarter is what it is. And that's important. And so that's the value of Facebook and Google and the amount of data they have, and Amazon with the Alexa, is that they're, you know, all that information they're gathering is they're getting not only content, but behavioral insights that we won't be able to compete. And so there's a great book called Surveillance Capitalism. It's a lawyer from Yale, and she argues that it's an unethical grab in capitalism, that they are grabbing this data and it's going to be to suppress competition, because they're going to have more information about me than I know. You know, and then they're building these models, and if it doesn't work, you know, we do it again and it gets smarter. And she paints a very provocative picture of the future when they know more than I do. Just as Google tracks us, there's very convincing research that says we have behavioral patterns that if I want to do something bad, I know where you're going to be on Thursday at 8 a.m. Because I've got this tracking. And so this is, you know, 9 times out of 10 at Thursday at 8 a.m. you are this place. And so when you feed those into systems, so I have to remember that when we catch bad guys, it's like, how do you catch them within an hour? Well, wait, they just went and did all this data grab and they knew a lot. And it's like, oh, so anyway, I'm not sure whether.
Recently, I read the comment that with the pandemic, you know, the scientists got the science right, but we didn't get the social science right.
Exactly.
Fascinating comment. So, you know, the social science of this, you know, how are we going to get that right? You know, like, how will we make some kind of equity happen? Because that's such an issue.
Yeah.
And many, many more issues around, you know, the social science of it all, you know. And Jim, I think, said something here about the need for the social affective component Jim is concerned about.
Yeah. We're seeing some work in that space relative to social robots, you know, to decrease loneliness in elderly. We're giving them a robotic pet that they can talk to, do things, but they don't have to take it outside, kind of stuff. But we're learning a lot about those interactions, and the initial research says it's very positive. So if you think about, you know, that's cheaper than a live-in companion, or, you know, these things that we can allow you to be independent longer. Well, what does that mean for a kid with autism? How do we develop, you know, a communication partner that, you know, is flexible and helps bring this out in a kid? So yeah, lots of, anyway, I don't know if I inspired anybody to do research, but that's one of my goals as I meet young professionals, to say, hey, we need smart people coming to the doctor programs.
Actually, you do. And next month, we have a doctoral, John Lloyd from the University of Virginia is going to talk about graduate studies. And Lindsay might be one of these who might hop in there into a doctoral program one day.
Let's start recruiting.
When the time is right, Lindsay, right? Well, thanks a million, everybody. This was absolutely delightful. And what a great topic, Dave. And we greatly appreciate all your totally generous sharing of your knowledge and materials and so forth.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you so much. And good luck to everybody. And we'll be in touch.
Thank you, Paula. This is good.
Joyful. Thank you, Dave. Much appreciation to you.
That's great. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, enjoy the Olympics tonight or whatever you watch.
No, it was a very good program, and I liked those first slides on the historical.
Well, good. Thank you.
And then I learned about Way Back In. Is that the name of it?
The Wayback Machine.
The Wayback Machine.
Put that in Google and it'll bring it up. And The only thing you need to know is a URL, and then it'll go find all the old versions of that page.
Oh,
So you can't do a topical search, but you can search, what this website used to be.
My goodness.
Okay,
Very fun.
thank you so much.
Have fun, Dave. Enjoy your Olympics later now.
Yeah, we'll see.
Good.
All right, best wishes.
Best wishes to you, and hopefully we'll run into each other one day. Good night, Pat.